Hi, Tony from all the remote things here today, and I've got my wonderful friend, Esther Derby. How are you, Esther?
I'm great. How about you?
Fantastic. Look, Esther, I know you really well because I've been working with you for some time and we've been talking backwards and forwards for years, but it might be really good for everyone to know, who's Esther Derby?
Well, what some people don't know about me that I started my professional career as a programmer. So I have that in my background and, forms part of my identity. But I've also done a lot of other things in the software space. And, I've been a manager and I've been a company owner. And through all those things, I've really been interested in how can we make work more humane, more joyful, more effective? How can we nurture change in our organizations and have that not be such a painful process? But yeah, I started as a programmer. And if I told you my favorite language, you'd know when I started as a programmer.
Would it start with C? would it have oriented business?
No.
All right. Interesting you say that because and a lot of people know you obviously for the retrospective book, but we're not here to
Sure.
really talk too much about that retrospective book today. But what you just talked about, your background and the threads that you're pulling together is the interesting thing that I was so keen to have you on and interview you around is that you've really brought that all together in your latest book, which is 7 rules for positive and productive change, micro shifts and macro results. I got it. There you go. Here's one she prepared earlier. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. What's the theme that runs through there? What are the important things? Why would someone want to read this?
Someone will want to read this if they have had the experience of trying to make a change in an organization and they work really hard on it and they implement a new process, but yet the patterns keep coming back. So it's like people are using different language, but they're getting the same results. Or if people feel like, I have this great idea, but no one wants to listen to it. They're resisting me. I mean, there's a lot of guidance in there about how to deal with resistance. There's a lot of guidance about, what holds the pattern in place. Because very, very often, and I see this with Agile a lot, people come in and they put a new process on top of the existing, organizational policies and structures. And, pretty soon, they're saying Agile words, but the same patterns persist. So I would say if you've experienced either of those things, this book might have some interesting guidance for you. Or if you've had the experience of, we're going to roll out this new process and then it turns out it doesn't fit everywhere. Yeah.
Which I think a lot of people see that, right? And
a lot.
The interesting thing I felt when I read the book too, I love that I've, as I said, followed a lot of your stuff, and I had the pleasure to interview you many years ago as well. You've brought together those threads of some of the things that you've been talking about for some time, the scene model itself, and the stuff. I'll talk about that a little bit. So let's start with the scene model. Talk to me a little bit. Hey, how did that come about? And then and that thread then is how you built that into the book.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I've been talking about the scene model for many years, and I first published it under a slightly different name in, I think it was 2015. I called it the seed model at the time, but someone pointed out to me, because it was steering, enabling, and enhancing and doing, and people pointed out to me like, well, we're doing stuff too, so don't just imply that there's only one group of people that are doing. So then I changed the name to be steering, enabling, enhancing, and making, because everybody in the organization is doing stuff. So I first started articulating this as a way to help people think about where patterns might originate. Because very, very often, people identify problems on the team level or the making domain. I don't actually usually call these levels, I call them domains. And problems show up there. right? So the teams don't deliver on time, or the teams deliver, stuff that isn't exactly what was desired, or something else is going wrong. And the tendency is to look at, oh, how do we fix these teams? But the problems don't necessarily have their origin on the teams. They may have their origin in the way the team was designed, or the way the team is supported, or it may be the way the work flows into the team. And all of those things are in the enabling and enhancing domain. And if, the product misses the market, that's not the team's problem. That's based on decisions that were made about the market and the products. And that's the steering domain. So it was a way to help people think about that, and a way for me to go in and look at an organization and be able to talk to people about, what we're observing and where we actually need to be working on it. And then over time, I started using it to help people think about their roles differently. I used it in kind of a dialogic way. So there's the kind of diagnostic way, and there's the dialogic way, where people start having conversations about, what do we need to do in the enabling and enhancing domain to make it possible for people in the making domain to really excel at their jobs. So we were able to talk about roles. We were able to talk about responsibilities, not in a rigid way, but in a way that said, this is what we need to do in order to fulfill the, or answer the concerns of this particular domain. So it doesn't say get rid of hierarchy, but it says think differently about what you really need to accomplish, what you really need to do in order to have teams that can do the work they need to do to create the products and services to meet the customer needs and make money for the company.
So let me pick up on that a little bit, because one of the things I really like about the model is the leadership intent that's built through the model.
Sure.
So often with lots of different things that I've come across, or even when you hear people talk about it, it's very easy to poke holes in leadership, right? And it's easy to go, it's all leadership's fault. But what I like about the conversation that this creates is it's actually not about saying, well, you're bad leaders or it's bad. It's about how do we change that frame. And what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. That it's not about pointing the finger at the leaders and saying you failed. It's about saying, there are important concerns in every organization, whether it's, very small, whether it's 10 people, or whether it's a huge organization. You have to answer these concerns, which are represented in the domains. And, that in some ways focuses off the finger pointing and onto, oh, we really need to be focusing on this, these concerns, like, what market are we in, and how do we support teams, and how do we flow work into teams, and the teams have to be concerned about how do we make the best use of our skills. But kind of jumping off from your question about pointing fingers at leaders and saying bad leaders, that's a very paternalistic way to look at organizations. Like, the leaders are supposed to have all the answers, and the rest of the organization just kind of waits for the leaders to have all the answers. And it's not realistic, and it's not adult, right? So if everybody is sort of aware of the concerns that they need to focus on, that distributes responsibility through the organization. But the other thing that goes with this model, and we've talked about this before, is this whole idea about how knowledge bifurcates in organizations, and the people at the top tend to know the contextual knowledge, and the people at the bottom tend to know how to get things done day to day, and there's an overlap often in the middle management. But that bifurcation means that the people at the bottom do have to wait to be told what to do, because they don't understand, they don't have the contextual knowledge to make good decisions, on the day-to-day work. So I think of it, I think of it as two kind of overlapping triangles, and these 2 points form a little diamond, and you have to make that diamond bigger so that everyone can be more responsible in an organization, not in a blaming way, but because they have the information to do their work and make decisions.
Yeah, and I think the thing that strikes me with that is that often it's the organizational construct that's built itself up over those layers of detritus. So often it's not the actual fault of the leaders. They may have inherited even that structure, and then they
Sure.
themselves in it. And that's why they hold on to that. And that's the reason I mention that, because it brings me to the other piece that I mentioned previously, is the 3 C's, right? Which has a part to play in this conversation. You want to talk around that a little bit as well?
Sure. So the 3 C's are how you put a lot of this stuff into action. So these are system influencers: clarity, conditions, and constraints. And you have to pay attention to clarity, conditions, and constraints in each one of these domains. They're a little different, right? But that's one of the ways you shape patterns in organizations, is by attending to those 3 C's: clarity, conditions, and constraints. So, people need clarity about, what market are we in? What's our value proposition? How do we make money? Who are our customers? Everybody in the organization needs to understand that in order to do great work. A development team can't do great work without understanding those things. They can follow instructions, but they may easily go astray because the instructions may not give them that context. Conditions have to do with people having the means to do their work. So, being a real team, having the material and the budget and all that kind of stuff they need to do, how the work flows in, which I keep mentioning, because I think it's so important. And then constraints, we often have policies in organization. People think about their policies. Well, policies are a form of constraints. So we often, particularly if you've spent any time around lean thinking, constraints are kind of, or theory of constraints. Constraints are viewed as bad, right? Because they constrict flow. But in a system sense, constraints can dampen flailing. So I just learned today from James McMenamin, he talks about them as shells and skeletons, which I thought was just brilliant. So you can have a shell that says, okay, within this constraint, you can do whatever you want. So it may be, within this $30,000 you have to spend on test tools, spend it on, buy whatever you want. Or it can be a skeleton, which says, as long as you do this, you have freedom about this other things, or you do these things related to this skeleton, and then you have freedom around the rest. I thought that was a really nice way to describe constraints, and I'm going to start using it, and you should too.
I would too. And a shout out to friend James.
Yeah. So I had another thought about constraints. What were they? Oh, it may come back to me. But that when people have that kind of guidance, they can take action without feeling like, oh, I'm going to get slapped if I accidentally stray outside of this boundary that I don't even know about, right? And that's one of the reasons to articulate the boundaries, is that when people bump up against them, then you can have a conversation, right? And I think in a lot of organizations, those boundaries are utterly unclear. And so people make a decision, and then someone comes along and slaps them and says, oh, that's not your decision to make. Or they make a decision without recognizing the implication to other parts of the organization.
Yeah.
So,
and often they've been built up over a period of time as well, right? And so people don't challenge those constraints because it's just the way we've done it, right?
Right.
And I think that's part of that thing about that I like about the 3 C's. It really does help you think about that layer of it and how you can challenge those things. Yeah. I'm going to take a little extraction with that now. So for people that are watching this for the first time, how I know Esther, obviously I said I've interviewed her, etc. But within the species of working with remote agility framework, we had the serendipitous moment to come together, and we realized that a lot of the work that we were doing around governing the system of work, leadership, etc., was very how would you say, synonymous. We had very, very similar things that we were working
Yeah.
on. So we've had the value of working together over the last few months, 8 months or so, working on the governing systems, and you'll see some videos. So I won't go into that today. But what I really wanted to talk to you about is that obviously you work with lots of organisations, and I'd like to hear from yourself. What are the things that you're seeing at the moment with the remote and hybrid working that's really causing problems that we need to address? Because I think I interviewed Esther Derby just a little while ago, and excuse the euphemism, he said remote work sucks. What he meant was remote work sucks when it's done badly, and I think that the point being is a lot of people feel that if they're not following the right construct. So your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the things that is a real issue around remote work is particularly in organizations where managers feel like their job is not creating conditions and helping work flow smoothly, but their job is day-to-day task supervision. When you can't see people and you can't see what they're working on, you freak out if that's your orientation. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was actually a huge run on surveillance software for employees, where you load this software onto their computers and you can tell what their keystrokes are and what website they've been looking at, and how much time they're spending in each application. And some of them actually use the camera to see who's in the room with them, or do facial recognition. So I think that is actually a huge problem. It conveys such an enormous lack of trust, and that lack of trust is reciprocated or responded to in ways that are often very, very detrimental to the organization. Now, I mean, obviously there are some sensitivities around data when people have their computers open in their home, but there are many, many different ways to deal with that. And so I think that's a huge one. So we have to figure out different ways to create an environment of trust when we can't see people. And that in some ways has to do with clarity, conditions, and constraints, right? If we're clear about, what behavior is encouraged and what is discouraged and what won't be tolerated, most people will work within that, right? Without being monitored. And frankly, I don't care if someone is getting their work done, if they spend some time on the couch playing video games. I don't care, as long as they're getting their work done, and they're not doing something illegal or unethical. So I think finding a way to create trust without resorting to surveillance software, which actually destroys trust, is hugely important with remote work. And the other thing I think, a couple other things people have to grapple with are how do we maintain team cohesion? How do we maintain networks across the organization when people, can't just casually, meet someone in the lunchroom? They can't just bump into somebody at the coffee bar, or, ask for a 10-minute meeting, or walk, out from a meeting with someone. So I think that's something we really need to attend to, or we're going to end up with a whole bunch of little tiny silos. Like, could be a 1-person silo within a 5-person silo. So I think that's really important. And related to that in some ways is how do we think about what we have to do together, what has to be synchronous, and what can be asynchronous? Because being on Zoom for 8 hours a day is deadly.
Yeah.
It's just deadly. For a whole bunch of reasons. There's research into it about why it is so tiring for people. So I think those are some of the big ones that come to mind for me.
Yeah, and I obviously gravitate towards those, and I think you've undersold SEAM in that mix as well, because the reality of it is SEAM allows you to understand what's required at the different layers of the organisation, to what they need to be able to work properly. And so unless you do address those things, then obviously remote working is not going to be great, and that's the species of remote agility framework. It's also the species of the work that you've been doing with us and we've been doing here. Now, as I said, I'm not going to jump into that today because we've done a whole talk on that. So if you are looking at all the remote things channel, you'll find a lovely talk there done by Esther and I on behalf of the remote agility framework team.
And for our team, it really is the work of the team. It's not just you and me.
So have a look at that, because that's the sort of things that we're trying to do to address. But I thought it was very poignant. And secondly to that, I think it's not just what we're doing addresses that, but you certainly walk through a lot of that within your book. So that I just wanted to draw that line back to the book. I'm going to take another right turn here and step away from.
Okay, I'll try to keep up.
that stuff now. A lot of people don't know, but they will know now, is that obviously everybody knows about the retrospectives book, but you're actually working on a second edition of it that's going to come out. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
We are. Yeah. Well, I'm going to go on a little loop-de-loo first, which is I actually learned about facilitation through leading technical reviews, which turned out to be that skill turned out to be hugely useful in all sorts of meetings. It got me interested in facilitation, which got me towards the retrospective stuff. But yes, we are doing a second edition. That book was written in, I believe it came out in 2006, and it's still actually selling really well. But it reflects a particular point in time, right? When the assumption was that teams would be face-to-face. And when the assumption was that teams might not have great facilitation skills, or that their coach or their scrum master or whoever might not have great facilitation skills. So we thought it was time for an update because the world has really changed. And we started working on it, I don't know, maybe, close to a year ago now, actually, I think was when we started talking about it. But the remote issue was a big part of the impetus to work on that. We are working with a third co-author this time. We brought David Horowitz into the mix. He actually runs a software company that makes software for remote retrospectives. So he has a depth of knowledge on that aspect. And so, it's updated. It has more guidance that's kind of framed in a way that assumes a greater level of facilitation skills, but doesn't assume that everybody's in the same room.
And I think that's the really interesting part, is that you're looking at it from that point of view. Because I have a dog-eared copy of retrospective, as many agile coaches, which is where I grew up coaching agile, do. There's all these questions I've always wanted to ask against that book, though, or even the one that you're doing now, right? And the first thing is, what shines through it is a real passion for retrospectives. How did you get so passionate about that it brought you to writing an entire book about it? I'm not, it was necessary. It was definitely necessary, but I just always wondered what brought you to that whole thing.
Well, as I said, I came to the skill of facilitation, which I think is actually a really important skill for managers and coaches and team leads and anybody who's trying to help people work together as a group. So I came to facilitation through that, and I was introduced to the idea of retrospectives at a workshop that Jerry Weinberg used to do with Gene McClendon called Chain Shop, where we did a little retrospective, and that's when I first was introduced to the idea of or put together, the idea about working, looking back over a period of time to see, what happened, what patterns do we see, what patterns do we want to change. And I also, through Jerry Weinberg, met Norm Kurth, who wrote probably the first book on retrospectives, project retrospectives. But at that time, projects were a year or more long. So writing the book about agile retrospectives came about when teams just started working in a much more rapid cadence, not rapid in working fast, but rapid in delivering more frequently and at smaller chunks. So that's where that idea came from. And it seemed like it would be really helpful for people to have some guidance on just, how to do that without being a professional facilitator, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And it was. And I think one of the poignant moments of it is that, as a person who's coached many teams across the world over my 20 odd years of doing this thing, retrospectives, what worked well, what didn't work well, what puzzles me. There's so much more that you can do than just that frame.
Right.
And the retrospective books helps you lift that up, right?
Well, that's one of my pet peeves is that, people think they can make 3 lists and dot vote and choose one action, and that's a retrospective. I mean, well, they can do that. And if you have a really good facilitator, you might have a really good conversation that gets you beneath the surface and you actually identify some of the influencing factors and start working on those. But most of the time it's just 3 lists, dot vote, done. And I get why people who have only been exposed to that kind of retrospective think retrospectives are not particularly useful. That might be a useful part of a retrospective, but if you're not getting beneath the surface and thinking about, well, what is holding this pattern in place? What is contributing to this pattern? What do we need to learn in order to be more effective in this particular way? If you're not doing that, if you're just, 3 lists, dot vote.
Yeah. And essentially what happens then is what I've seen with teams, they just become disenabled, right? The retrospective says this thing that we go to that takes an hour of our time or whatever it be. And we get nothing out of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can see why they are disenchanted with retrospectives if that is their only exposure to it.
Yeah. And I think that's been propagated through certain frameworks have just made it by rote. And so what I would say to anybody that my top tip, we're talking top tips today, Esther and I, my top tip on that is whether it be the retrospective book or it be something else, change it up and make sure that it's got focus that's useful for the teams. Just because it's in the pattern, whether it be a scaling framework or it be whatever it be, just because it's in that pattern, it says you've got to do it X, that's not necessarily going to get you and the team what you require, right? So that was
I think you touched on an important word there, which is focus. I think every retrospective should have a focus. Like today, we're going to talk about how we're doing TDD. We said we were going to learn TDD. Let's talk about how we're doing it. Let's talk about our technical practices. Let's talk about how we're collaborating with this other team that we have dependencies on. So, but make it focused, because, if you're just like making a list without any focus, it's just going to be too scattershot to get anything out of it.
Yeah, so, and you see that, it's whether it's iterative or sprint or whatever you want to call it, the language is at the end of the sprint, it's just about what do we do in the sprint? And okay, that's okay every now and then, right? But I agree with you, that's the first thing I do with them. Say, okay, well, we already know something didn't go well. Let's focus on that, and then let's get some traction on it, because that's what we're focusing on. This is some ability to do so.
Or this worked really well for us. This went really well. Let's figure out what made this possible and see if we can make it happen more often.
Yes. That's the other one that you see regularly is there's very little time spent on the good and a lot of time spent over in the right-hand column. And what I tend to say to teams is, look, it's an offset term, but, good is the enemy of great, right? And if you're going to go from good to great, then you need to either amplify it. And don't forget, most of the things that are in your good column probably came from the bad column anyway. So you want to make sure you don't go back there. It's really easy to slide back there as well.
Well, in some ways that takes us back to clarity, conditions, and constraints. So what are the conditions when we are able to be at our best? Right? When we did great this iteration, what made that possible? What made it a likely outcome? Can we make that happen again? Can we make more of that magic? So I think it is super important to also focus on what we can amplify.
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask you, when's the book likely to hit the shelves?
Oh, it's hard to say. We are wrapping up the last a few chapters, doing some revisions, writing some new chapters. And once that happens, it goes to some editing, and then it goes to feedback, and then it'll hit beta release. And at that point, it'll be available to the world. But I can't predict the date at the moment.
Brilliant. Look, we're right at the end of our time. I wanted to thank you for spending the time.
Yeah.
How do people get in touch with you, Esther, if they want to, or get the books?
Well, yeah, you can always email me at esther@estherderby.com. You can visit my website at estherderby.com. I've got a podcast called Change by Attraction, which is inspired by the book. So you can find me there. A new episode the last Monday. Oh, let me start that again. The last Wednesday of every month. Yeah, so that's some ways to follow what I'm up to. But yeah, I always love to hear from people. So yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. You hit me up on Twitter. Yeah, all those ways.
Brilliant. All right. Look, that is really the end of our time. So again, thank you for being on all the remote.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking with you.
Oh, it's been fantastic. And for everyone out there, look, I can only say working with this has been an absolute pleasure. And she will answer. She answered me, right? So, look, fantastic to have everybody here today. Don't forget, like and subscribe us, all the remote things. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.